You believe, or at least you have said that if you had to bet on one particular character to be Satoshi Nakamoto, you would be betting on Paul le Roux. And we would love to hear why.
Well, I have to be. I feel like I knew this because I'm, as you said at the beginning, I'm not super into the crypto world. Like my writing has touched on it a little bit. Like I'm aware enough as a person who is reads about and writes about tech, and I worked for Wired magazine for a long time, but I've never actually covered it, and I'm not sort of like amidst that world. But one thing I do know from my friends who are is to be very careful with how I describe my feelings about this,
Yeah,
because
let's build the disclaimers.
what I really think, and what I wrote an article in Wired magazine about it, is that of the people, all these people have been floated, as possible Satoshi. And if you
Yeah,
look at and you look at Paul le Roux, I feel like Paul le Roux is the strongest candidate. Now, a couple of caveats to that. One is that there's actually been a really interesting candidate that's come out since I wrote that. Who's this? What's his name? Oh, Len Sassaman, who someone wrote like an actually kind of brilliant Medium post about how it could be this guy who sadly committed suicide. So there's even been candidates since then. But my argument was and is that if you look at the people who've been proposed, I think Paul is actually like pretty strong candidate. The
first of all,
problem,
Evan, sorry to interrupt. It's impossible not to interrupt in Zoom, but can you spell out this guy's name for anyone that would like to look him up?
oh, which one? The new one?
Yeah,
The new one is Len Len Sassaman, Sassaman. And there's a Medium post by a guy named, it's just Evan H is what it says on here. I don't know if he's truly anonymous or people know who that is, but it's a very, very interesting, it came out a couple months ago, February. And it's really similar to what I wrote about Paul le Roux. It's like trying to piece together a narrative, but it also lacks evidence. And this is where my other caveat comes, which is that I think if you compare Paul le Roux to the entire universe of candidates, it's probably not him. Like it's probably someone that we don't know, we don't think of. And so it's very easy to say, if you look at such and such person who's been proposed, I think Paul le Roux fits better. But there's no actual definitive direct evidence that shows it. It's all circumstantial, it's all narrative. And so you're just fitting a story to something you want to believe. And that's part of what I was writing about was, how we can convince ourselves. And I was extremely convinced at one point that it was definitely him. But then I sort of took a step back and looked at the evidence and realized the evidence is really, it's a story. It's like a
right.
lot of coincidences. But that said, they're pretty basic coincidences. I mean,
I mean,
and I,
when we're looking at mysteries, you have to think that, like you said, you were trying to fit a narrative to the story, right? Or the story to a narrative. Because if there was evidence, if there was solid evidence, we wouldn't even be talking about this, right? We would know. But that said, the case you lay out is pretty convincing. And as you say in your Wired article, when you were building out the pro list, the evidence, those seem to stack up in favor of le Roux.
yeah. And I think it sort of starts with, le Roux's background, which is, it's just extremely compatible with what we know about Satoshi and what we know about what went into building the original Bitcoin. Because a thing that le Roux had done in his 20s, in the late 90s, early 2000s, was he had built his own encryption software. It was disk encryption software. It was called Encryption for the Masses. And it was an open source software. He built it entirely himself, just worked by himself for several years, and then went online and released it to the world and announced it on a message board and said, hey, I've made this thing. Now, that's very similar to the idea of Satoshi building most of the elements of the blockchain and, fusing these different ideas and then sort of showing up and saying in 2008, saying, hey, here's this thing that I've built. And then you sort of start from there, and then you look at the experience that Paul le Roux had. He was a C++ coder. He's people who worked with him, in the legitimate world before he became a criminal, said he was, the most talented they'd ever seen. He's got this encryption experience. He also wrote about his sort of anti-banking and anti-government views, which align very closely with some of the posts that later came out, Satoshi's posts. He also worked for banks. So before Le Roux went to the illegitimate side, he had worked for banks, building payment systems for banks. That was his job as a contract coder. So experience with the currency system, like there's just all of these things that kind of fit together in terms of his story and the way it maps onto Satoshi's story. And then I think one of the biggest ones is that I think anyone who's interested in this, and I do think it is very interesting, this is one of the richest people in the world if they're still alive. Like, I can't imagine why someone wouldn't be interested in this, but you hear people say like, who cares? It doesn't matter who Satoshi is anymore. But it's just inherently fascinating mystery. It still is. And I think one of the questions you have to answer is, why haven't any of the coins moved? Like, why hasn't any of the money been spent? And there are two really obvious answers. And one of them is that the person is dead.
Right.
And the other is that the person is in prison. And Paul le Roux fills the second one. So I think the fact that he's incapacitated and he can't do anything with the money is a kind of point in his favor, as it is to someone who's no longer alive, because I think it's someone could have the fortitude to never spend that money, but I think that's one of the things that makes it such an incredible mystery. So there's all this, and then there's a lot of little things. So I kind of go through, I don't know how many of them you want to go through, but there's just all these little connections. And if you start looking at them, you can definitely convince yourself that it's him.
Actually, that was kind of what sparked what started the snowball that ended up with us having this conversation, because someone was talking about Satoshi in my Cyprus cryptocurrency group, and they were saying, well, it doesn't matter who this is and everything that you just said. And it's a bit of the more condescending type of things people used to say, right? Like, we're all in here for the tech, we don't care about the money, this guy must be on the top of the Forbes list. And I'm like, fuck you. Like, of course it matters who this guy is. And um and then someone said like, okay, yeah, but he's probably dead or in prison, I added, and no one had ever even considered the in prison part. I read your article like a long time ago, and I'm like, well, this guy built a great case on why this guy might actually be in jail and be like this super famous criminal, and no one had ever heard of that. So I'm like, okay, I need to get this guy on the podcast to talk about it, because it's just such a great story.